Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at our spring webinar, our initial recap of the fall 2020-2021 admission season. We'll wait for people to queue into the room. We got a great response to this webinar, and so we're happy to have a nice, robust group with us. I'm Bari Norman, and I'll be handing over the reins to Leslie Singer, our moderator, and let each of us introduce ourselves. But thank you again for joining us. We got a lot of questions in advance. We're going to try to cover as many topics as possible. And if you do have questions, use the Q&A feature down at the bottom, and we'll be moderating and taking a look at those as we go. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Leslie for some other administrative items.
Hi, so I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I always love these evenings. My responsibility really is to find people fabulous homes, to sell their fabulous homes, but many of my clients have really benefited from both Bari and Sasha's assistance. So tonight we have Dr. Bari Norman, of the co-founder and head counselor for expert admissions, and she's truly that, an expert at college admissions. And Sasha DeWind is the CEO of Tutor Associates, and while they are fabulous at SAT and ACT tutors, they also, well, both of you do distinguish yourselves by being compassionate and incredibly knowledgeable. So I'm thrilled, as always, to be with you too this evening. Do we want to wait a couple minutes before we start housekeeping and polls? And you tell me.
Yeah, why don't we, as people are still queuing in, so
Okay.
we're going to let people come in a little bit. We'll wait another minute or so as people queue in, and then we'll start running the polls. We wanted to find out, you'll know, for those of you already on, we're going to be asking just a little bit of information so we can get a sense of the audience, and we can also adjust our answers and our topics according to who's out there. But what I'll do is, as people are still queuing in, I'm going to actually launch the poll, and we can keep it up for a little bit. So if you could let us know what grade you're in, this will be super helpful to us, again, so we can know how to adjust our topics and what we discuss.
It says we can't vote.
No, maybe because you're. I think people are voting. I can see it all coming in. We got people coming in.
Okay.
It looks like we have mostly 11th graders, although we still have some votes coming in here. But mostly 11th graders, followed by 10th graders, and actually equal for 9th and 12th graders. So.
Wow, nice.
Yeah. So, okay, it looks like we're good. So yeah, we've got a bit over half who are 11th graders, which is helpful for us to know. I'm going to shut the poll. Thanks to everybody who voted in. The other question that we had for everybody out there is, if you've been following us, we've been doing these webinars since the beginning of the pandemic as a way to stay connected and to share information, even though we're all separate, as a way to connect. And we wanted to know how many of you have attended a prior webinar with us. We know that there are a lot of returning folks, and it's also helpful so we don't repeat some of the stuff that we've been talking about in past webinars. And it looks like votes are still coming in, but it looks like we're almost at 3/4 have been with us before.
Okay.
So we love a loyal crew. So thanks to everybody who's been here before and is back again. So, all right, we've got mostly 11th graders. We've got mostly people who have seen and heard us before. So without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, I think what the very first place we should start out is, how do you think this year was different?
Sure, I can take that.
I think people really want to know what the playing field is and has been.
Yeah, as a more general question. So From an admissions perspective, no surprise, of course, this year was test optional pretty much across the board with very, very, very few exceptions. You know, the public universities in Florida really being the exception. That was a big change for the way that colleges approached reading, and it also meant a surge in applications, especially at the more selective schools. A lot of students, not surprisingly, felt that without their test scores having to be submitted, that their chances were better. That may or may not have been true, depending on the individual student, but the perception certainly was that it would be easier and therefore made more sense to throw your hat in the ring because of test optional. We also know that more students applied to more colleges than typical in this year. I think that is a result of people feeling that there was going to be an enormous amount of uncertainty, both in predicting maybe what would happen from an admission standpoint, what your admissions decisions might be, and also after looking at last year's class saying, hey, I might feel really different in the spring than I do now, and either want to stay close to home, or right now I want to stay close to home, but maybe the pandemic will be a whole lot better and I'll decide that I want to go far the way I initially anticipated. So people were really trying to keep their options open. We obviously saw admit rates plummet, particularly at highly selective and selective colleges, precisely because of this surge in applications. There was no way the admit rates weren't going to move significantly when colleges were getting, 33% more applications, 51% more applications than in prior years. From my perspective, and I'm just like, expert admissions and my students who I work with directly in particular, we're just but like a little speck in the universe, but I can obviously speak best about my students. We really saw a tremendous uptick in the number of students in regular who got multiple offers from the most selective colleges. So multiple kids getting Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, Harvard. In a typical year, if you were in regular decision, ideally one of those would come through. And if you were lucky, like two might come through, but to hit on 3 and 4 is not typical. And I don't know if that was something that was specific to my students, or if we'll see a broader sense of that with those colleges going to the wait list, perhaps, because obviously each of those students can only go to one college. And I think it's saying a lot that I had 3 applications to Stanford in regular, all 3 got in and none are going. And I just think that in and of itself tells you like what an extraordinary year it is. But again, I'm just a spec, so I'll be very curious to see if this applies to the broader applicant pool. But I have a lot more to say about, kind of some general things and about some specific colleges. But I would say in general, that's kind of been the, on the larger scale, and then in my practice in particular, the thing that was most noticeable.
Can you talk about, was test optional? I don't know if you can really talk about this yet. Was test optional truly optional? Like, do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I mean, I think to some degree it was, and to some degree it wasn't. I think that for those of you, we know that most of you are juniors who are listening. So if you're a junior, don't think of test optional as a pass. And if, for most of you have been with us before, I've said this over and over again since last March when we knew nothing about what was going to happen. My stance hasn't changed when we saw the results. If you want to try your best, you want to try to give scores that are strong for a particular school, you may find that you give scores to some of your colleges and not others, but your goal in your head should be just as it was pre-pandemic, which is go in, work hard to get the scores. Now, there were students that I worked with where we realized that no matter what they were going to do, we hit a certain point. They've been working hard for a long time. We were far enough away from anything they really needed. And we said, just stop and actually take the gift of test optional and let's try to use it to our advantage. And we were able to do that in a few instances where that was the decision that was made. I had one student this year who certainly, test optional made all the difference in the world. But that is not the typical case. And you have to know which schools you're kind of playing with, and how you're going to look at a particular school without scores. And there's not a general answer of like, do it or don't do it. The only general answer I could give is do it if you can and try to do it and get it done. And so I think it depends. Can you be successful in this process without scores? Yes. Will you have a better predictive ability if you give scores, and will you have a better chance at getting into certain schools with them? Yes. And all of those things can be true at the same time. So I think it's really particular to the student, and I think it's really particular to which school you're talking about. And Sasha, you may have something to add on the testing front.
In terms of the last year, what we saw was really just a shift in when people tested because of the logistics of it. I mean, every single one of our seniors, our current seniors, tested successfully. It meant a lot for them to do that. They worked really hard to test. So that was more important to them than anything else, even if they didn't need the scores. All of our kids tested and they all sent scores, or almost all of them did. I think for me, I always want to give the sort of the right amount of time and the right amount of money to this process. And for some kids, it's just not going to be worth it. And a year ago, I would have said the same thing. Let's put our time somewhere else. There are lots of great test optional schools. This is not going to be something that helps your child. That's the only point, right? To get a score that really helps you from an admissions perspective. Otherwise, we can focus on other things. And my advice hasn't changed. If your child will need too much time that they need to devote to other things, sleep, extracurriculars, school, whatever it is, then we make that decision together that it's not the right use of the time, or that the cost is too high. And it really hasn't changed. Those kids going for the most elite universities from top private schools in New York, they all tested and they all sent scores. And I think, when we saw a big decrease in kids sending scores nationally, our kids are a little different, because our kids were ready with those scores, so they wanted to send them. And that's my hope, is to always be able to give kids options. If I can give you the option of having a superb score, I want to. If that's not going to be an option or the right use of your time, then we do something else. And it can be a gift. And it was a gift for a couple of our kids, for sure.
With our students also, everybody was able to test in the end. Maybe not exactly when they initially anticipated or when they wanted, but anybody for our students who did not submit scores did so for strategic reasons, not because they didn't have access. And that ended up at least being a good thing, that students who knew they were ready and could do it were eventually given the opportunity, which I think is important. And we would expect it to be similar, going forward.
And I think, nationally, you saw that it was like, there was sort of like 50-50 in terms of who they were accepting, and different schools have released data on this and some haven't, in terms of, how many kids applied with scores and how many didn't. And there'll be more information about that from some schools, and other schools will never tell us. And if you look at the language on their, from the admissions office at all these top schools, they're saying, be thoughtful. Think about what you're going to be sending us. And I think that's what I say, and what Bari says too, right? This application is their chance to see your child or you, and you have to be very thoughtful and purposeful about where you put your time and how you develop that application.
Are there any pandemic related policies or opportunities that you think may be here to stay? And I actually love the fact that this question is almost like a post-pandemic question. So
right? Who would have thought? I do think test optional is here to stay in theory. I think we are going to see most colleges keep it as their policy. Again, and Sasha just touched on this a moment ago, you can look at the national story and the national numbers, but you have to think about your particular situation. And so even though most colleges, I would suspect, will keep tests, certainly next year, or almost all of them, or all of them will keep it. I mean, we're still in the midst of this. It would be quite unwise and silly for a college to go back next year. But let's look forward even a year after that. I think after colleges have this in place and have, are in their groove and see what they're able to do, it's in the institution's interest to be test optional. It gives them the most flexibility of all, and they'll benefit from higher, applications. And I mean, there's really no downside for them. There could be downsides for students, but there's no downside really for the colleges. And so it would be surprising to me for a variety of reasons that colleges will turn that back. I'm not saying no colleges won't turn it back, but I do think that test optional as a general policy is here to stay. I think it's a good thing because for some students, they're going to be able to use that to their advantage. But I think students have a misconception about what that really means. And of course, everyone's looking for an out on these tests because they're not usually, no offense to Sasha, but they're not usually the most fun part of the process. But that's why when you have somebody like Sasha, they make it easier and more manageable. I'm not your gal for that, but I think that people are looking for an out because it can be dreadful, and it's a long, long haul. But even though you want the out, you have to keep your eye on the prize, and you have to think about, when you're going into this, you want to maximize your chances within reason, but you want to maximize your chances, right? So if you want to maximize your chances for getting what you want and where you're headed, the answer is to try to go for scores. It doesn't mean it cannot work out without them, but it's going to be harder on average.
And I think what Bari was saying about this year, next year, just to be really clear, juniors can expect pretty much everywhere to be test optional. So if you're a current junior, your child's a current junior, that's the blanket, pretty much everyone. Current sophomores, you're getting a mix. You're getting some saying we will be test optional for our sophomores, and some saying we might not, or we're not sure, we're going back. And there's a mix. And then the ninth graders, we just don't know anything about. So that just gives you a little sense of where we are. I think you're going to end up with a sort of hybrid, like we already had, by the way. Bowdoin was already test optional and Wesleyan was already test optional, and our kids were sending scores because they had them. And so I think you're going to see a much more flexible landscape in terms of scores and how we use them, and the tests are going to try to respond to that too, which we can talk about. But just to be clear, for 11th, 10th, and 9th, what the sort of story is from the admissions perspective at the moment, what they're saying.
There's a question, sorry to interrupt. There's a question that came in: did most of your students submit tests? And the answer is yes, most did. Not all, but most. And then another question: did or are the schools releasing the breakdowns of kids with scores versus kids without scores who got in? Very small numbers so far have done so, but some have.
And Sasha, you said, fortunately for your students, anyone who wanted to test had the opportunity to test. Going forward, since we have a lot of 11th graders, do you think in-person testing will be the norm? How do you see for them going forward?
Yes. So right now for the SAT and ACT, a couple updates. They're still on paper, in-person tests. So nothing has changed. They were never offered online. There was a little foray with the AP, and we can get into that. But the SAT and ACT this entire year have been paper tests, and our kids have tested safely with certain extra precautions. Going forward, there are vague plans to create online testing for these two tests, the ACT and the SAT, these two central tests. But at the moment, if you're a junior, if you're a sophomore, we'll see about the freshmen. I would just count on in-person paper testing, the good old way. And we're hoping to quickly get back into simulating that and being able to offer that for our kids, not just via Zoom. So that's sort of what's staying the same. What's changing is the SAT's completely gotten rid of their essay. It's going to be gone by June, which, Bari and I never paid much attention to these essays, but I'm glad it's actually gone because I never paid attention to it. So why add it? And the ACT does still have an essay, and it doesn't mean much to me. So I guess what I'm saying is that for both of these tests, they really are about the main multiple choice components, the math, the reading, the grammar, and the essay has either completely disappeared or is still there nominally, but is unimportant from an admissions perspective.
For those, and I would think most 11th graders have decided this, but for those that haven't, or those who are in 10th grade, how do you decide? Are you an ACT person? Are you an SAT person?
Sure. All of my 10th graders are coming in for, well, they're coming in, they're signing on for full length SAT diagnostics or ACT diagnostics, both. Some kids do them at school, some kids don't. I don't care where you do them. They should be full length. They should be in the morning. They should be proctored by a real proctor, not by mom. We simulate it. We don't let our kids mute during their Zoom proctoring. If they're chewing gum, we need them to be annoyed by that, right? This is part of the experience. So the full length diagnostic, no hybrid tests, no little mix match, no PSAT. I want the full length of each. From there, it's sometimes really obvious. Other times the kid has a sort of qualitative experience with one test or the other that determines the path. I'm an ACT girl, and the reason I'm an ACT girl is because I like predictable things, and I find the ACT very predictable. I'm a cautious person, so there are things on the ACT that I think are, harder in content, but more straightforward. There's things on the math that I think are particularly good for certain types of kids. We can get into that on a much deeper level once a child has some data to look at. But the best thing to do is to just take those tests and have someone meaningfully walk through them with you to understand that data.
If you were to just give a one or two sentences, how would you just simply differentiate the SAT from the ACT?
Sure. Well, the SAT is 2 sections. It's a verbal score out of 800, math score out of 800, kind of like the good old days. They switched it up for a while and made it out of 2400, but it's back to 2 scores out of 800. And I would say the SAT is a sort of a puzzle. It's a game. So there's lots of sort of little conceptual puzzles, much less sort of content tested in a straightforward way. And I would say that unlike the ACT, the SAT is not so hard on you with time. They don't make you go so fast. So you have enough time to do the SAT, but it's tricky, and it's some might say fun. The kids who pick SAT might say fun. The kids who pick ACT don't. And I'd say the ACT is, the ACT is 4 sections. It's a grammar section, a math section, a reading section, and a science section. And so it is different in the way it's laid out. And I think the big thing about the ACT is I find it very predictable. Every science section has 7 passages and 1 non-data, and the whole thing is very predictable, but they don't give you enough time, and it's not the most fun test, I would say. And that science section turns a lot of kids away from it. And I could go on and on about the differences.
Yes.
Like I could go on about the math sections, but I just think they are comparable exams where kids really need to try them out.
Subject tests. What's happening?
They're gone. Goodbye. Goodbye, subject tests. I think Georgetown still says if you already took one, we'd like to see one, because
Georgetown says they still want them, even though they don't exist.
They don't exist. Sorry, Georgetown. We've gone away. They were already going, and I think the key thing is that your testing portfolio is really your ACT or your SAT scores, and sending your best set of ACT or SAT scores is the most important thing. Subject tests, you can forget about them. They're gone. You can't even take them. So
on life support before they were officially cut off. So it was like, I think it was like a nice headline, but I think in the reality of like students' lives, it really was not real news.
The big shift was for engineering students. All of our kids applying to engineering schools always did math and chem or math and physics, and they always needed 800. So for those kids, it was a big shift, but for everyone else, it wasn't such an important component of the application.
And APs and AP testing, yes?
Yes, APs are happening. They are happening in many different forms this May. They're happening at school, in person. They're happening, there's another round where parts of it are done at home or at school and parts are done online. And then there's a third option with just full online. They are just hedging their bets. They're making sure that no matter what, your child can take the AP. They are full length this year. They are not abridged. And our kids are using the APs the way they always have. If they're in an AP class, it's the period at the end of the sentence, right? They're preparing and taking it. If they're not in an AP class, it's really about what kids at their school are doing and whether or not it makes sense for them to sit for an AP exam. And I'm sure Bari will tell you, like, if you're in an AP class, it's great to have that score. It's, for me, great to have college credit when you get there. But again, it's the ACT or SAT score that I'm really focused on in terms of the testing portfolio.
There have been a lot of questions. I've gotten a lot of questions about like taking APs. Now that technically the subject tests are gone. Oh my God, what other tests should I take? Oh, should I take APs even though my school doesn't offer APs and I'm not in an AP class, that like suddenly I should give a different test because one has been quote unquote sort of like taken away from me? And the general answer is no. There's no reason to shove another test in there, especially when you're not in the class that goes with the test. And typically the truth is that testing usually corroborates good grades. Good testing corroborates good grades. Lower testing usually, like on an AP class in particular, unless you're in a school where you get easy A's and the class is a joke, and then you go to take the AP exam and it's like a disaster. That was me in high school with my AP bio class, but that's another story. But the idea is that if you're in an AP class, if you can get the 5 ideally or a 4, you should have other 5s, you ideally want to get 5s. And if you need to a 4, we don't submit 3s because any school that really cares about AP scores would say a 3 is low. So if you're submitting 3s, it's really probably to a school that isn't looking so closely at them. 3s may count for credit at some colleges, not all. A lot of colleges won't even accept the 3s. At a lot of colleges, they don't accept 4s for credit. And the way that they determine credit has changed drastically because as college admissions has become more competitive, everybody who gets in could come in as a junior. And so they've had to adjust like credit versus giving credit for like intro classes, but not really giving you numerical credit. So, you've got to check at each school what their policy is regarding credit once there. But from an admissions perspective, if you can show 5s, maybe a 4 here or there, you submit it. If not, no worries. If you have an AP course on your transcript, of course, there's a natural question of like, had this student do on the AP exam, but we would be much quicker to not submit a low score and let them just not see anything as opposed to submitting a 3 to show them a score that goes with an AP course. And so, it's not just about submitting scores and, adding an AP exam, when you haven't taken an AP class isn't really going to do anything for you, especially if you have good grades. And it's typically a student who has good grades who's looking to do something like that. So you're really kind of chasing your tail with that. And I just don't recommend it in general.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Bari, we don't talk about this frequently in other seminars we've given. Can you talk about when someone's deferred? Is there something that you can be doing, and what have you seen this year, and how do you go about a deferral situation?
Sure. So this also is school dependent, and obviously it depends on the case. Generally speaking, if you look at the numbers, you would say a deferral is really in your mind. You should kind of assume that it will turn into a deny in regular. It's hard to turn around a deferral, but not impossible. I had a few students this year who found themselves deferred and then admitted. 2 of the students were students who came to me later after they were deferred and wanted to try and turn it around and were nervous about regular decision stuff. And we were able to turn around a deferral at Cornell and a deferral at Stanford. I was also, one of my students was deferred at Yale early, and then we turned that around. So it's possible. You've got to be really particular, as you should be with your main, with your essays in the first round. You need to be very specific and very particular to the school. Just saying, I'm going to come, if you take me, and just giving an update is not what is going to make the difference. It also depends what sort of we think the misstep was or what the issue was at first. So for students who have come to me later after being deferred, usually there's clear missteps and we're kind of just we're kind of fixing or doing some cleanup work, so to speak. And I don't work with too many students in those instances, but I'll take on a couple of people a year. And then if it's a student who was deferred, who worked with me, usually it's an expected deferral. And the idea is that we sort of expect the deferral and the hope is to be able to turn it around. And so we're basically building off of what we submitted at first and kind of creating a stronger, more up-to-date application. So just like the supplemental essays are extraordinarily strategic and particular, so would be deferral follow-up if you really want to try to turn it around, or if you're hoping that it might turn around. And usually you're looking at, like, I don't know about this year because we don't have those numbers yet, but at a highly selective school, percent of students who are deferred and, deferred and then admitted, certainly less than 10% on average, and maybe in the single digits, closer to 5%. In a good place, you could be looking at 15 or 20%. It really depends on the school. But it's definitely possible, but not the norm. You should assume a deferral is not going to work out in the end. So try to refocus and sometimes re-strategize for ED2 or even regular if your second choice doesn't offer ED2. But if and the interesting thing also is students who are deferred, by the time regular rolls around, even sometimes when it's turned around, one of the students I was just referring to, a Stanford deferral that we turned around, she's not going at the end of the day. So we did what we set out to do, but we also were able to accomplish more at getting in at other places. And then she said, Stanford what? And she's going to go to Harvard. And so it's sort of like, it's interesting that students can also change their perceptions and kind of change their vantage point depending what their options are in the end. And even sometimes when they don't get an equally or more competitive option, they were told no, they kind of move on and they move through, and suddenly another school looks better to them and it becomes an option. So not all kids who are deferred necessarily want to go in the end, which is interesting.
I should note that my 6 and 2-year-old are already on the wait list for Bari.
My kids don't want to work with me, so they'll be safe. Don't worry.
I can refer someone. We'll figure it out. I'll help.
But this also kind of leads to a question, and we're getting several of these questions about, can you do anything to change your position on a wait list?
Yes, as well. I mean, similar to deferral, you should assume a wait list is going to turn into a deny. That is by far the most likely outcome. But just like a deferral, you would be following up, right? Everyone's heard about letters of continued interest. Again, just saying you would go if admitted, which you can only say to one place. And even if you don't see the moral problem with saying it to multiple places, you're going to get in trouble at your high school if you do it. So don't do it. But even saying I'll definitely come and then giving the update, like, that ain't nothing. Like, that's not going to move you. You need your application to work for you. You need your letter of continued interest to work for you. Otherwise, you're going to just coast on through to a deferral, a wait list, a deny. They have so many kids. They have so few spots relative. You really need to do it in a very strategic and specific way. And so it really would be different how you would follow up with one school versus another. You're the same person, just like if you did the essays right at the outset, you're doing same person, same story, different presentation, different focus, different way of talking to different audiences. And this is no different. But waitlists absolutely can turn, but the most likely scenario is that a waitlist will ultimately turn to a deny. Last year was totally bonkers because so many students shifted plans, and there were a good number of deferrals at the most selective schools. Not as much actually, as it turns out, generally. But last year was just like a really truly unusual year. We'll see about this year. I don't think we're going to see as many deferrals, that's for sure. I think that those high levels of deferrals are done.
To make yourself potentially a more, a stronger candidate, a lot of people look to super scoring. Sasha, can you talk about super scoring, what it means, how do you do it, does it change your application, etc.?
Yeah, so super scoring is the mixing and matching of different subsections across different test dates. So if you take the SAT a couple times or the ACT a couple times, the idea is you kind of mix and match your best math score with your best reading score, and it makes you a super score. And it sounds really nice, and it can be really nice because you can have two really strong performances, and maybe they're just slightly stronger on one side here and slightly stronger on the other, and we'll send both scores, and some colleges will mix and match and some won't, and that can be a really great benefit to kids for whom the college mixes and matches and for whom their scores are really strong, but a mix and match, a super score, makes them even better. I guess I don't pay that much attention to super scoring until like the very, very end of the process, because my goal is to make sure a child has one set of scores that they can send that is effective for their admissions process, that maybe they can send two sets that are really great. But I'm all about a concise testing portfolio. There's no need to show them things that might give them red flags. There's no need to show them. I've had a kid say, do I have to take the math if I already got an 800? Yes, they're going to see everything. And not only are they going to see everything, but some schools won't even super score. They don't even have that policy. So if a school does super score either the SAT or the ACT, and I'll talk about the ACT in a minute with super scoring, but if colleges say, yes, we'll take a super score, you can assume they're going to still see everything, and that an admissions officer is going to look and say, well, this person went way down. I think maybe that 730 was a fluke. Like, why did she get a 570 the next time? We're not sending that. So I guess it can be a benefit. It's a thing in our pocket that sometimes can be really useful, but I'm not going for multi-day mixing and matching. I'm just going for great performance on either the ACT or the SAT. And the ACT has pushed really hard to push super scoring. They've created a new score report that automatically presents the super score to the colleges. And so it's very exciting to students. They go, well, look, my super score will automatically be there. Well, sure, but the colleges just care about what they care about. And if they care about the super score, they'll look. And if they don't, they'll look at all those scores you've just sent them. So again, the companies want to make it easy to super score because the kids love super scoring. Some admissions offices are happy to do it, but I'm all about sending as few scores as possible and great scores. And I know that sort of begs the question, do I have to show my scores? Do I have to send my scores? And the answer is sort of. With both the College Board and the ACT, you have tremendous control over releasing your scores to colleges. You have to go in and actually send them to Yale, and you have to pay money, shockingly, to do that. And they just sit in your account. Nobody, until you do that. And the ACT will even let you delete your scores. So you don't like your scores at any point, you can go in and just write to them and they'll delete them. So on that level, you have a lot of control, but there are schools that will ask to see everything. And you'll have to, go with the rules of whichever school you're applying to. And your high school may also be putting those scores on high school transcripts and other things like that. So I think it's important to test when you're ready to cancel or delete scores that are going to make you just make a mess of things later. To me, it's mostly psychological. I think if you have a bad testing day, there's no need to look at those scores. There's lots of ways to not see them. Mostly our kids test when they're ready, they get great scores, and then we just pick which ones we're sending when it's done.
Yeah, I think also one thing to hop on a point that Sasha made is that, your school can look at things a certain way. They can say, I was talking to one of my students today, and he was saying that he's in Spanish 2 as a 9th grader, and so he's going to be in Spanish 4 as an 11th grader. And at his school, that means 4 years of Spanish. And it's like, well, that's nice that your school thinks that, but most colleges, certainly the ones that he wants to apply to, highly selective schools, are not going to look at it like that. So things can be a certain way in your school, or you can look at it a certain way, but colleges have their way, and they're not changing based on how ACT is presenting their score report, right? So great that ACT is doing the work for the colleges that are looking at a super score. But they're not changing their policy. And like Sasha was saying, they see, even with this new super score report, They see the individual section scores for each of the dates that's coming together to make up that super score. And these are human beings reading applications, and they can't unsee what they see. And they've got a whole lot more applicants than they have spots. And so while they'll tell you over and over again, and it's true that they're looking for reasons to admit, not reasons to deny, I can tell you as a former admissions officer, it's really nice when you can easily have a reason to deny a student when you have so many students where you're really going to have to dig and be really nitpicky and even annoyed at yourself as to what you're going to have to do to parse through, the ultimate, the ultimate decisions and the ultimate things that are going to keep certain kids in and certain kids out. And so you really want to be mindful. Don't go in with the mindset of like, I'm going to really hit it on 2 sections one day and another 2 on the other. Or, if you're an SAT person, focus on one day and 1 on the other. That is totally ick. Like if you're an admissions officer, to see somebody literally seeing them try to game it and take the shortcut. There's nothing less compelling and less good for you as an applicant than that. So you really do want to try to get it on 1 test day. 2, if you need to, is fine, as long as you're not having these massive, movements, so that you have, again, like Sasha said, where it looks almost like a fluke on 1 day. So, 2 times is fine, as long as there's not like huge gaps, if it's a little bit here and there, no big deal. But really try and get it done in as efficient, a way as possible.
And mostly I see some questions about if you delete the scores, if you delete the scores, nobody will ever see them. And when colleges say they want to see everything, you'll send what's in your ACT account. So you really do have a lot of control over what they see. And deleting and canceling is a way to, mostly for me, just protect a kid as they move forward in the program and make sure that their confidence stays high. But
purely a psychological thing. And I get it, like if you have a score staring at you in your account, it feels like you've got to dig out of it, and if you just, if ACT, you can actually delete it. With SAT, you can't delete it. You just wouldn't send it. But there are a lot of schools that let you use score choice, and you don't have to formally delete it from your ACT profile. But for some kids, like just seeing it is bad. And so for your own mental health, get rid of it, even though it doesn't matter from the college side.
And same thing with that College Board. If you had a bad day and you come out of that test, you don't get to look at your score first, but you can cancel that score and no one ever grades it. And again, you had a bad day. I don't need you staring at it unless it's going to be a learning experience, which is what practice tests are for. Bad days are for practice tests. That's why we do so many. We have the bad day. We learn what is it that affected your performance, right? Because it really is ultimately a performance. And so what is it that affected the performance? And if you have a really bad day on a real performance, you're just going to cancel the scores and we'll try again next time. It happens very, very rarely.
Yeah, it sounds like both of you are kind of saying fairly consistently that you should plan on testing twice and potentially not more than twice, unless.
I think there's a difference between how often you test and how many scores you send.
Yes, absolutely.
My kids test on average 2 to 3 times probably, and they send 1 to 2 scores. And
Agreed.
For those that are applying, can you talk a little bit about ED and early action and the benefits, pros and cons, and maybe the difference also for some of those who may not know?
Sure. The quick difference for those who are new to the terminology is ED is early decision, and that's a binding agreement. You can only apply to one place ED because if they take you, you have to go. And so you can't give that commitment, obviously, to more than one place. EA is early action, where you apply early, you get an answer early, which is similar to ED, but you're not obligated to attend. So you'll find out in either December, typically sometimes January, from schools. Some of the state schools notify in January under their EA programs. And the college, if they admit you, the college has to keep your space until May 1, which is the universal candidate reply date. This year, the Ivies and a couple of other schools moved to May 3rd because they notified a little later, but May 1 is the general date. And so generally speaking, there's an advantage to applying early, whether it's early action or early decision. Particularly with early decision, a college knows you're going if they take you, and that's attractive to them because they care about their yield, which is the percent of students who accept their offer of admission. This is important for rankings, and they care because it's important for rankings. And so ED, if there's a place that you really like a lot and that you can really see yourself going and where you'd be happy knowing the deal is done without seeing what else happened for you in regular, ED strategically is a great choice. EA also typically offers an advantage. It depends on the school because some schools offer ED, EA, and ED2, by the way, ED1, ED2, EA, and regular. They offer everything. In that instance, the boost is going to be stronger in ED than it will be in EA. For places that just offer EA and regular, the boost will be there in early action. So it really depends. And then you have places like MIT where there's no advantage at all. And so that's more an anomaly. And of course, Georgetown, always our anomaly. It's harder in early, it's easier in regular. So, everything is school dependent, but again, speaking in generalizations and in generalities, early there is an advantage to early. What you don't want to do is possibly end up locking yourself in somewhere where you ultimately don't want to go. So be really thoughtful about early. The chances also of getting in when you work with a counselor and you're trying to figure out what are my chances, chances if you apply ED versus chances in regular are going to be different and probably significantly so. When you're trying to figure out where's a place to ED, when you figure out the places that you really love, what you want to try and figure out is a place that you could maybe squeeze in early, but where in regular it's fairly clear you'd likely either be a deny or a wait list to deny. And so trying to find that sweet spot and that fit on both ends, not just where you think you'll fit, but a college that would also think that you fit for them, which has nothing to do with whether or not you can do the work there. That's really kind of the art and science of strategizing with a list and with early and with regular and so forth. But generally speaking, you're going to get a boost in early relative to regular. Regular is highly unpredictable just because there's so many more applicants, there's so many fewer spots, because a lot of the schools fill a good proportion of their class in early. The other thing is you've got tons of kids who didn't get in early, who were deferred, who were phenomenal applicants, and for every reason could have, should have, would have gotten in a different time or under different circumstances, who are now going into regular, making those pools even more competitive. So the thing about regular is it's just less predictable. There's certainly predictability to it, and we always do that. You're not applying to 15 schools, you're applying to maybe 8 or so ish, give or take. So you still have a fair amount, a sense of what should happen, but you're not going to necessarily be able to predict with precision what would happen at each school. You just kind of know, of these schools that are left on my list for regular, we should hit multiple, and these are the ones that are more likely. And another thing that's come up lately that I've gotten this question a number of times over the past week since the Ivies notified last week is the idea of people being really surprised and confused about students who get into a place that's a lot harder to get into statistically and then don't get into a place that's a lot easier. This is normal. This happens every year, pandemic or no pandemic, in regular in particular. Colleges are trying to figure out, who is likely to come, who isn't likely to come. They're obsessive about fit. They're obsessive about whether or not they think you fit, which again, has nothing to do with how high your scores are, how great your grades are. This is a subjective thing, which is why that kind of fit conversation when you're creating your list and when you're working on your essays is so crucial if you want to be successful, at the kind of your reach level, in regular. And so it is perfectly normal. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's perfectly normal that a student goes into regular, it comes back a mixed bag, including getting into places that are harder and getting waitlisted or denied at places that are technically easier. That's actually holistic admissions working, right? And when a student, gets into Brown and not Wellesley, real story, I'm not surprised, right? That happens over and over and over again. So it isn't unusual for those of you who are getting nervous about the process because of that. You got to know where you can hit it.
And I have seniors come to me all the time who are like, oh, I'm not going to go early because I loved all of these places. It's always the kids who love everything. They're just like really happy wherever they go. And they're like, but I loved all 7 of these schools. And so how could I? And I always say, well, then pick one. If you'll be happy at all of them, then let's be strategic and make sure we get into one of them. And maybe we pick the hardest. But I think it's so important that kids also know there's so many things they don't control about what happens the next year, right? Who their roommate is, what teachers they get, right? Things are not. And so you have to do your best and research and really pay attention, like Bari says, but then you also have to make a choice and see what happens in life. And I think that's part of becoming a grown-up too, right? Is making decisions, knowing that it does cut off other things. And that's not always the right decision. I know, Bari, there are concerns with financial aid and things like that. But when my students can apply early decision, I'm very much the sort of cheerleader for that.
Listen, strategically, it's always the answer, but you're going to have to potentially end up there. And that's the part that you have to really think about, right? So from a strategic, purely logical, objective standpoint, yes, apply early decision. It's going to be easier than in regular, like period, end of sentence. But again, you have to go at the end of the day. And so if you can end up locking something in that you're then going to feel trapped, when you see in the spring, other people having other options, or if it feels too like rushed. Some people feel rushed into it, like that's not good. But you've got to think about it. And I always tell students, you've got to think about what's going to really truly make you happy in the end, not just right now when, you wear your college sweatshirt to school for one day, but what's really going to make you happy. And you have to remember just how brutal regular is likely to be. So saying, I like all these places, do you really mean that? Do you really like every place on your list? And if the answer is yes, you really would be happy, at one of these other places that's more attainable for you, then maybe one that you're identifying more as either a reach or, a higher level target, then your answer is easy, but you have to really be okay, and comfortable and feel good about all the schools on your list, which gets back to doing good work and building a list, which will yield better essays, which yields better outcomes in the end. But it's really, really important. And I think students, you can't will things to happen just that you want to happen. So you really need to talk to somebody who's knowledgeable, who can give you honest, straightforward advice about what you can expect to see in early versus regular. And then you make the choice that's best for you. Do you want to wait it out and see, knowing that you could, a really, really strong student, it's not crazy for them to get a bunch of wait lists and denies from highly selective schools that then all turn into no's. And then you have some options that are more in that more kind of attainable target range. So you want to be so strategic about early, even if it's early action where it's non-binding, you want to be really strategic about ED2 if it's available, and even for regular. It's just so strategic at every point, because you want to make sure that you land somewhere that you feel good about, where you'll thrive, where you feel comfortable. And it's not just about where do you want to go. The match has to go from the college's side as well.
Do you think students are going to have the opportunity to tour, campuses, to get to know a school better? What is the update on that situation?
Cautiously optimistic that in the fall students will. I mean, none of us know for sure, but I'm cautiously optimistic that you're going to be able to see a close to normal, have a close to normal campus visit and sense of a campus in the fall. I think it's been hard, obviously, this year. Some colleges aren't allowing kids on campus. Even if you want to drive up on your own, you're not allowed to go on campus. They've done a good job at doing virtual programs, but getting on campus is obviously different. For those of you thinking about going in the summer, the one thing that I would say, normally I say try not to go in the summer because you don't get like the real kids and the real energy. But this year in particular, since most of the colleges that run summer programs moved virtual long ago, And so it's really going to be a ghost town if you go. So if it's the only time you can go and you just want to get a sense of the lay of the land and the campus layout and that kind of stuff, maybe a first visit in the summer. But I would anticipate trying to get again to a school that you were really interested in the fall. And just if you go somewhere and you're a little underwhelmed because you're just kind of looking at buildings and it's really quiet, I would just say give colleges a fair shake if you're going under, during that time. The summer is going to be a really tricky time this year to go.
Do you have strategic, can you give any input on how to best obtain a list of safety schools, like what people should be looking at? So you do have a broader and more secure list?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely need a range. Every student, regardless of if you're a super strong student, if you're moderate, and you with your grades and your scores, it doesn't matter. Everybody needs a range of schools on their list. Nobody loves all schools equally, and that's okay. But there should be a clear reason for you why each school is on the list. And it shouldn't just be, well, I love this school and people who apply to that school apply to these schools. It should be very specific for each school. With safeties, I always say a safety school is a place where I'll like fall off my chair if you don't get in. It's not a place I expect you to get in. It's I'll fall off my chair. So a place I expect somebody to get in is kind of like a lower target. And a place that I'm going to fall off my chair if they say no is a safer option. Everybody needs a safe option, and you don't need more than one, because if I'm going to fall off my chair, like I don't need to fall twice. Like it's without any guarantees, we have a pretty good sense that that's what's going to happen. Now, you need to know how each school behaves the same way we need to know it for everything else. You need to know how each admissions office behaves. Are they a place that kind of plays a bit of a game and will often put higher students for them on the wait list, or even deny them because they know they're not coming. And they're going to take some of those kids because they need them for the numbers, but they're not going to need to grab all of them by any stretch. And so is this a place that kind of plays that game, or is this a place that kind of does things more straightforwardly? Because it's not a safety school if they play that game. Then you're going to find yourself, not getting into your safety school. And then especially if that comes in early, you're going to say, oh my God, my list is all out of whack. So I think it's really important to know how each school behaves with regard to applicants that are especially high in their pool. And then once you know that, you can ascertain what is really going to be a safety and what isn't. And you may find that a school that you thought was going to be safe ends up being kind of a lower target, and you may not get in regular, which again would be expected actually at many schools.
Are there questions that I haven't covered? Because I know we're getting close to the end. I don't know if you,
Well, I'll just say that it seems
please.
We're at a place where there's so many new things that I think we'll certainly be doing another one.
Oh yeah.
Quickly, because it just seems like there's so many questions we didn't answer, and there's also a lot of specific questions, logistics of how you go about doing things, and can you cancel this, and so I'm always available after. You can email me, and I can make sure your individual questions are answered, and we can try to continue to give you guys the bigger sort of landscape.
When we send out the follow-up, our emails will be in there. Each of our emails will be in there. So if you want to follow up with any of us about anything, you'll be able to easily access our contact information.
Otherwise, we'll do this for 4 hours.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, but there are a lot of great questions here. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everything. We tried to kind of cover the big topics, especially based on what came in advance, and tried to hit on some of these that came in during.
And I think like when I listen to Bari every time, the thing I always come away from in all her advice is the specificity with which you need to approach each school, with the application, with the supplementary essays, with the, do they care about demonstrated interest, with the way that every single thing she says is always about understanding the school that you're interacting with. And I just think that's such an important takeaway as you navigate each of these pieces. It's all about making clear to that school. And I think it would be much easier to do that when you find the right fit.
The other thing also is that it doesn't matter how your school does, whether they do well with a certain college or poorly with a certain college. It's about applicants. It's about individual applicants over and over again. People are like, well, we don't do so well, or our school does well. It does not factor into my assessment of whether or not a particular student is going to get in if their school generally does well, at least as perceived by, like the public or by the, by the school community. It has nothing to do with whether or not you are going to get in. Some schools do better at certain universities because they tend to turn out the kinds of students that school is looking for. It doesn't mean they take everybody from there, but they've got more of what they're buying. So it tends to be a virtuous cycle, but it's not that they like you better or that they're going to be easier on, kids from another place, or that they're going to be harder. Some students don't want to apply to certain schools. They'll say, I don't want to apply there because my school doesn't do well, or someone else in my grade is applying. And it's like, well, they're them and you're you. And if you're both, what they want, they'll take both of you. And if only one of you is what they want, then they'll only take one. But it doesn't scare me that somebody else in your grade is applying who's a legacy. Like, so what? Like, are you going to fit? Is it going to work? And that's really the question. So that's another thing that comes up a lot. And it just doesn't matter. It's all about you.
That's a good life lesson too, right? I mean, with everything, you have to just focus on what is in your control, what's in your child's control, and the rest needs to be tuned out because it's, and I love what Bari, they'll always take who they want. If they want 7 kids, they'll take 7. If they want 4, they'll take 4. There's not like a limit.
Over again. You'll see it over and over again. And you'll see one year they took 8. Oh, next year they only took 2. Well, that's because you only gave them 2 they wanted. It's not because they liked you last year and they don't like you this year, or they're acting so erratically. They're actually behaving exactly as we expect them to. But you have to present yourself as, the kind of candidate that they're looking for. You have to understand how each of them behave and what their things that they tend to respond to. And after you see tons and tons of qualified kids go through the process and where they're successful and where different kinds of students aren't, you can start seeing that. And sometimes, a place that you really love isn't going to see it, right? It's another life lesson, right? You like somebody a lot and it's just not reciprocated. It's like life, a life lesson, in a little bottle here. But, but it's the same thing. Sometimes you're going to really feel it and the college won't feel it no matter how hard you feel it. And other times it's like, it's a great love affair and it comes together, and you just try to navigate as best you can towards the right place.
I always love these discussions. You both bring a wealth of knowledge, but also in just such a passionate manner. And in what I hope that everybody else feels is you try to decrease anxiety and just make it a much more pleasurable process.
There's so many fun parts, and you have so much more control over this process than people think. I think a lot of people feel like the process is happening to them, and there's nothing that could be further from the truth. I mean, granted, we don't make the final decisions, but you have an extraordinary amount of control over, what you're presenting and how you present. And there's a fair amount of predictability. Again, we can't precisely, know exactly what's going to happen, but in general, when we have a list of 8 schools ultimately, or 10 schools or whatever, we can predict pretty well actually what's going to happen without being the ones making the decisions. And so just remember that you do have a lot of control over it, and that makes it less stressful. You just have to understand the process and, work with people who at school, outside of school, whatever, who can help you better understand the process and how each piece impacts you.
And it's the same thing with the tests. You have to understand, right? You have to understand them deeply. And once you do, you have control. It's not, I just talked to a mom today who's like, I don't know if I should do tutoring. And I was like, I don't either. Let's figure it out together. Let's make sure you have the information to figure out if you need this and what it would bring you and what it's, because you, as a parent, when you're given good information, then you can make decisions with your child about what's right instead of trying to help other people, let other people make those decisions for you when you and your child are the ones who are doing this together. And it's an important time to do it together. So it can be a really exciting, fun process if you have the information to do it.
Yeah. And just this last question, and then we'll wrap up because we're a couple minutes over.
Please.
Someone asked if we have results for this year, will you be sharing or posting it on your website? We have on our blog, we've got Ivy rates, we've got colleges requiring vaccinations in the fall. We've got an updated test optional list. So there's a lot of people have a lot of things. They're like, which colleges are this? Which colleges are doing that? And we update it. So if you go to our blog on expertadmissions.com, you can get admit rates, and we'll be continually updating those. We'll be updating them as they come in.
We'll be sending out our class of 2021 admissions as well. And we'll be sending everyone t-shirts. So stay tuned. If you haven't let me know where you're going or your child's going next year, please let me know. Let me know t-shirt size. It's my favorite part of my whole thing. So let me send you a t-shirt. You're a senior.
All right, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you for joining us. And again, thanks for being a loyal group, with 3/4 of you returning to be with us from a prior webinar. Stay tuned. We're going to have more. We definitely will have one after waitlist activity moves. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Wow. Thanks.